The Old Beggar. The Man on the Street. On the busy streets of Willowdale, where people walked with purpose and cars honked impatiently, there sat an old man. His face was weathered with age, his beard long and unkempt. His clothes were tattered barely enough to protect him from the cold. He sat near the entrance of a cafe, holding out a small tin cup, hoping for the kindness of strangers. His name was Thomas Grant, though no one had called him by his name in years. To the world, he was just another beggar. People passed him by, some sparing a glance, others pretending not to see him at all. Occasionally, a kind soul would drop a coin into his cup, but most walked past, too busy with their own lives to notice the man who had once been like them. Thomas had not always lived like this. There had been a time when he had a home, a family, and dreams. But life had a way of unraveling even the strongest threads, and one by one, he had lost everything. The fall from grace. Many years ago, Thomas had been a businessman. He had owned a small bookstore in town, a place filled with the scent of old paper and the sound of quiet conversations. He had a wife, Eleanor, who had loved him dearly, and a son, Michael, who had been the light of his life. But then tragedy struck. Eleanor fell ill, and despite every effort, every doctor's visit, and every prayer, she passed away. Grief consumed Thomas, leaving him hollow and lost. His business suffered, and soon the bills piled up. He tried to hold on, but one misfortune followed another. A fire broke out in the bookstore one night, destroying everything he had built. The insurance company refused to pay due to a loophole in the policy. With no money, no business, and no wife to keep him grounded, Thomas fell into despair. Michael, young and unable to understand the depths of his father's sorrow, left. He went to another city, hoping to start fresh, and never returned. Alone and broken, Thomas found himself on the streets. At first, he thought it would be temporary. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The world moved on, and Thomas became just another forgotten soul. The kind stranger. One cold evening, as Thomas sat in his usual spot outside the cafe, a young woman stopped in front of him. She was in her mid-20s, wearing a thick coat, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail. Unlike others, she did not rush past him. She crouched down, looking at him with eyes filled with something he had not seen in a long time, compassion. "What's your name?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had asked. "Thomas," he finally said. His own voice sounded foreign to him. She smiled. "I'm Claire." She reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich. "Have you eaten today?" He shook his head. "Here," she said, handing it to him. Thomas took it cautiously, as if it were a fragile thing. "Why are you helping me?" Claire shrugged. "Because I can." As she stood to leave, she added, "I'll see you tomorrow." Thomas watched her walk away, his heart heavy with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A second chance. True to her word, Claire returned the next day. And the next. She brought him food, sometimes a warm coffee, and most importantly, conversation. She asked about his life, his past, and in return, she shared pieces of her own. She worked at a publishing house, loved old books, and had always wanted to help those in need. One day she asked, "Thomas, if you could change anything about your life, what would it be?" He chuckled bitterly. "I'd have never lost my bookstore." She tilted her head. "You loved books?" "With all my heart." A thoughtful look crossed her face, but she said nothing. A week later, Claire arrived with a bag in her hands. She handed it to Thomas, and when he opened it, he found a book inside, one of the classics he used to sell in his store. "I thought you might like this," she said. Tears stung Thomas's eyes. It had been so long since he had held a book, since he had felt like more than just a beggar. A path forward. One evening, as they sat on a bench in the park, Claire hesitated before speaking. "Thomas, have you ever thought about leaving the streets?" He sighed. "Where would I go? I have nothing." "You have knowledge," she said firmly. "You know books, you know stories. And I have an idea." She explained that her friend owned a small bookstore and was looking for someone to help. "It's not much," she admitted, "but it's a start." Thomas's heart pounded. Could he really do this? Could he go from begging on the streets to working in a bookstore again? "I don't know if I can," he whispered. Claire placed a hand on his. "I believe you can." And for the first time in years, Thomas wanted to believe it too. The bookstore. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the little bookstore, his palms sweaty. Claire nudged him. "Go on." Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The scent of books enveloped him, bringing back memories he had thought were lost forever. The owner, a kind old man named Richard, greeted him warmly. "Claire tells me you know your books." Thomas nodded. "Then let's see what you can do," Richard said. For the next few hours, Thomas worked like he had never stopped. He arranged books, recommended titles to customers, and even fixed a wobbly shelf. By the end of the day, Richard smiled. "You've got the job." Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. He had a job. He had a purpose again. Rebuilding a life. Over the next few months, Thomas's life transformed. He found a small room to rent, saved his money, and slowly rebuilt himself. He still visited his old spot on the street sometimes, not to beg, but to help others the way Claire had helped him. One day, as he sat in the bookstore, organizing a new shipment of books, the doorbell jingled. A man walked in, his face familiar yet aged by time. Thomas froze. "Dad?" the man whispered. It was Michael. Tears streamed down both their faces as they embraced for the first time in years. "I looked for you," Michael said. "I thought you were gone." "I was," Thomas admitted. "But I found my way back." A new chapter. Years passed, and Thomas never returned to the streets. He continued working at the bookstore, eventually becoming its owner when Richard retired. But more than that, he spent his days helping those in need, offering books to the homeless, giving advice to lost souls, and reminding people that even when all seems lost, There's always a way back. And it all started with a simple act of kindness.